So let's talk about estimations for a little bit. The group of developers, they have to be able to estimate the PBIs in the product backlog. If they can't estimate those PBIs, it's basically impossible for the product owner to answer the question of the stakeholders, when are you going to be done with this? So the developers have to be able to estimate the PBIs. Now, Scrum doesn't tell you how to estimate. You can estimate however you want. If you're doing duration-based estimations, things like hours or man days, you can keep doing that. I would recommend, however, that you switch to relative estimations. It's typically going to be a better way for the developers to estimate the PBIs. So let's take a look at how it works. So for this, let's use an example. Imagine that I'm asking you, how long does it take you to swim 100 meters and 400 meters? Try to think for a second, quickly. How long does it take you? It can be in seconds, minutes, hours, whatever you need. How long does it take you to swim 100 meters and 400 meters? When I ask this question in a training, I get a lot of different answers. So you might see things like, for 100 meters, people saying, well, it takes me 1 minute, it takes me 4 minutes, it takes me 40 seconds, not realizing, of course, that the world record is more than that. And you get a range of answers. And then you repeat the exercise for 400 meters. What was your answer then? You might see things like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 18 minutes. So if you ask people this question, you're going to get a wide variety of responses. So imagine for a second, you're the project manager for the swimming project. Which of these estimates do you use? The highest, the lowest, the average? You see, you already have a problem here, right? The second thing to realize when you're doing this is that the difference in the estimates is going to increase the bigger the thing we're estimating. So if we look at the highest and the lowest estimates for 100 meters, typically you're going to have a delta there of 2, 3, 5 minutes, something like that. The difference between the highest and the lowest estimates for 400 meters is going to be a much wider margin. It's just harder to estimate big things. If we were to take an approach of relative estimations here, how would we do this? Well, the first thing would be, let's agree on a baseline, some kind of sample size that we can all agree on. So typically a team would take a look at their product backlog and just agree on a small PBI. So let's try to apply a relative estimations approach to our swimming project. How would we do that? The first thing the team would do is pick a baseline size, something that they all agree is kind of small and easy to do. In this case, it would be the 100 meters. And then we just give that a number. Let's say in this case, a 1. There's no duration here. It's just a size, right? It's just a 1. And if we all agree that 100 meters is a 1, what would be the size of swimming 400 meters? Go ahead, think about it. Typically what people are going to say is somewhere between 4 to 6, right? Some people are saying, well, 400 meters, 4 times bigger than 1. Some people are calculating they're going to get a little bit tighter along the way and not swim the last 100 meters as fast as the first 100 meters. But you see what's happening here. We have a much narrower range of differences in answers here. Now we're discussing between 4 and 6. So the first benefit we're going to see when we do relative estimations is this idea that we start to create this common language. And this is really important for a Scrum team. So let's explore a couple of examples of when this common language is important. First, let's just think of a very practical example. The developers have to estimate the PBI. If you have a cross-functional group of developers with an analyst, a tester, and a developer, for example, what are these people estimating? If they're each estimating their own work, then the product owner has what, 3, 4, 5 estimates for a PBI? Do I then just add them up? Are they working on the same scale? This becomes a challenge, right? With relative estimations, this conversation becomes easier because the analyst no longer has to think about how long it takes the developer to build something. They just have to think of the relative size. How much more difficult is this to develop than that to develop? So here's the first thing we're taking away from this. When a Scrum team is estimating a PBI, what are they estimating? Not their individual work. They're all estimating the same thing, definition of done. What's the size of getting this PBI to done? Second thing to keep in mind here when we talk about relative estimations, what is this exactly? Well, let's think about an estimation normally. Normally when we're estimating, we're thinking about 2 things. We're thinking about the size of the item, and then we're thinking about the duration. So for example, in my swimming example, when I say I need to swim 100 meters, the first thing I'm doing in my head is thinking, okay, how long is the swim pool? Let's assume 50 meters. So that's going to be 2 times the swim pool. Here, I'm thinking about the size of the work to do. The second thing I'm going to do then is the duration. All right, let's assume I take 1.5 minutes per swim pool length, and then I can estimate the full duration. With relative estimations, we don't do the duration part. We stop at the size. Another reason why this is valuable. Let's go back to the real world. Think about our PBIs. Think about estimating the work. Typically what I see, the first person giving that estimate, the first person setting the expectations for the stakeholders on how long something is going to take is not the developers. It should be, but it's not in the real world a lot of times. Who's doing that initial estimation? Some kind of very experienced person. a senior person in the delivery organization, or somebody with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge on how to do this. The equivalent in our swimming example of asking Michael Phelps to estimate your swimming project. But then what happens later? I have to go swim it, and then people are yelling at me because I'm not swimming at Michael Phelps' time. And what am I saying? Yeah, I'm not Michael Phelps. What do you expect? When we go to relative estimations, it doesn't matter. Think about it. How much would Michael Phelps estimate for the 400 meters? It would also be between 4 and 6. It wouldn't be any different than everybody else's estimations. So by using relative estimations, we can create a common language that creates cohesion between the group when they're thinking about the size of the work to do. Another reason why relative estimations is valuable is because it removes the fear. A very simple example of what I mean with fear. Imagine a story that the product owner is sitting down with the developers doing backlog refinements to estimate the PBI. So they talk about, the developers ask questions, they understand what it is, and now they need to estimate it. But just at that moment, the phone of the product owner rings. And they're like, excuse me, guys, I have to take this call. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Go ahead and estimate. I'll be right back. Product owner leaves the room. The developers estimate. And let's say that in their conversation, they come out with, okay, this is going to take 2 months to build. Right as they decide that, the product owner walks back into the room. Says, all right, guys, sorry about that. So what's the estimate? What number are they going to tell the product owner? Ideally, they would say 2 months because there's trust between the two. But in the real world, a lot of time they're going to say, 3 or 4 months. Why are they adding that buffer? Because people are afraid. So they start to inflate their estimates and they'll say 3 or 4 months. So they're buying some buffer in case something goes wrong. Now, of course, I've also seen environments where the developers are doing that, but the product owner is also experienced and knows they're doing that. So the product owner is challenging the first estimates just out of instinct. But the developers know the product owner is going to challenge the first estimate, so they inflate it even more so they can negotiate it down to that first inflation. You see what's happening here, right? It's a big dysfunctionality. With relative estimations, it doesn't make sense to inflate the estimate because you're not promising a duration. You remove the fear. If I estimate something as a size of 5, you cannot come yell at me later if I take 2 or 4 weeks to do it. I never promised a duration. And because it removes the fear, you get better data. So how to get started with relative estimations? There's many techniques out there. A very popular one for teams is called planning poker. It's an easy one to check out and learn how to do. And it also brings in a valuable innovation for estimations, which is it uses something like a Fibonacci scale, which means the numbers in the lower end of the scale are closer together. So you would have 1, 2, 3, 5. Why? Because it makes sense to have those conversations about whether something is a 1, a 2, or a 3. On the other end of the scale, however, we have a lot larger spaces between the numbers. Why? Because I don't really care if something is a 17, an 18, or a 19, because like we said before, we're not good at estimating big things. So at that level, I only care about, is it a 13? Is it a 20? Is it a 40? This is really helpful for teams getting started with estimations. So using relative estimations with your team is a good way to get some clear benefits. First of all, create that common language so that developers can all speak the same language when estimating. Secondly, you remove the fear because we're no longer promising durations. We're just talking about the size of the problem. And thirdly, you're going to end up getting better data because you have removed that fear. So relative estimations are an easy way for teams to get started with estimating. It creates this common language necessary so that the developers can have good conversations to understand the size of the work to do and also any problems they might be having. So try it out for your teams. I'm sure it's going to be helpful.